Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, The Art of Recognizing Clinical Supply Risk Factors and Applying Proactive Measures to Avoid Study Delays and Disruptions, presented by Catalent. I'm Ricardo Castaño, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speaker today is Reed Tonick, Director of Clinical Supply Chain and Project Management at Catalent. You can read his full bio on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. This webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Reed, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're calling in from today. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Reed, and I'm speaking with you today from Pennsylvania, where I live and work in my current role at Catalent. I hope that from the hour that we spend together today, you learn something new. And if you're an experienced clinical supply chain person like me, hopefully you'll benefit from a different take on the challenges that we face every day. There's no easy answer when it comes to managing the supply chain of investigational products for clinical trials, although some people think that there should be. For instance, my mom still can't understand what I spend all my time doing each day at work. As she says, there's a trial to see if a new medicine works, so just figure out how much they need and then make sure they have it there and when they need it. What could be so hard about that? Why do they keep paying you to do this? And maybe some of your clinical operations or CMC colleagues have the same perspectives as my mom. On the surface, what we do managing clinical supplies should be simple. It's supply versus demand, economics 101. But as we'll discuss today, there are trial and product characteristics which complicate the planning and execution. These characteristics cause increased variability, which can cause increased risk to stock outages and or overages. And these supply deficits or excesses can cause study delays or increase to overall costs. So by the conclusion of this webinar, we'll probably not come up with an answer to all your clinical supply chain problems, but at least we'll share the proprietary tools and processes that we've developed as a methodology for identifying, evaluating, and proactively managing the inherent risks. So now that you know who I am and what this webinar is about, let me explain who Catalent is. Catalent have many interrelated drug development capabilities, both clinical and commercial. The clinical capabilities are here down on the bottom right-hand column of the screen. The business unit of Catalent that I'm representing today is Clinical Supply Services, and the stats on the screen are related to that function. In Clinical Supply Services, we work with pharma and biotech sponsors of all shapes and sizes, from your traditional big pharma with tens of thousands of employees and hundreds of clinical studies, to emerging biotech and cell and gene therapy companies, which are small or virtual sponsors. The point is, Catalent has designed our network of facilities, depots, and services to accommodate a broad range of sponsor needs. This broad range is what allows us to expertly identify the aspects of a clinical protocol or treatment type that will create increasing complexity. And only by managing these complexities appropriately will we not cause detriment to the conduct of the trial. And when I say conduct, I mean having the right drug at the right place at the right time, so that clinical teams can enroll new subjects. Essentially, our experienced teams have managed enough studies to see all the we can create tools and processes to prevent them, or at least minimize the chance of them happening again. Okay, so that's it for the introduction. Hopefully from that, you now understand who I am, what Catalent does, and the purpose of the discussion today. So let's get into the meat of the webinar. On screen are our objectives. In short, I'm going to explain which aspects of a study protocol can directly influence clinical supply strategy, which types of studies and sponsors are at increased risk for clinical supply challenges, how sponsors can proactively understand and address clinical supply related risks, and finally, to understand clinical supply planning resources available to help complex studies start on time and stay on track. This will hopefully be the only slide that I read to you today, but there really was no shorter or better way to say it. So first off, let's explore the characteristics of the drug products themselves and the trial designs that lend to increased complexity at increased risk. These are the things that a clinical supply manager at a sponsor or CMO company first look for when determining how scared to be. The simplest way to differentiate the factors that lead to risk and complexity is to identify them first by phase of study. I know there's some phase 0 studies in oncology, and most phase 1s now are combo studies with phase 2. But for simplicity's sake, let's look at them phase 1 through 3 in the traditional sense, which is what you see depicted here. Phase 1 being a handful of clinical sites in dozens of subjects or fewer for a few months. Phase 2 being a step up in patient size and duration across multiple countries and regions, and phase 3 being in hundreds to thousands of subjects for several years and across the globe. So let's take a look at the supply challenges in phase 1. First off, the dosing scheme of single ascending dose or multiple ascending dose SAD or MAD studies can cause great variations in the amount of drug needed. One additional cohort can lead to the demand being twice or 3 times what was originally anticipated. Secondly, the shelf life is typically just developing, so whatever expiry a study starts with is likely to need to be updated throughout. Since the overall cost and duration of the study are lower than in other phases, there's rarely justification to employ an IRT system to manage the randomization, if there is one, and the drug supply. The unblinded pharmacist at the site is helpful to compensate for this. However, that also increases the burden on clinical supply managers and clinical operations personnel to manually account for drug reconciliation and resupply shipments. In phase 2, we now have the introduction of multiple treatment arms, each with their own ability and likelihood of titrations, dropouts, and crossovers. And oftentimes now an IRT will be employed to manage the randomization, the dispensation, and the resupplies. Multiple packaging campaigns will likely be needed to account for the extended retest dates and to adjust for country-specific labels or country group booklets to actual enrollment. Without unblinded pharmacists at sites, the packaging and labeling will now ensure the blinding across treatment groups and dose levels. Phase 2 is usually the first time a full-time clinical supplies manager is needed. In phase 1, some sponsor companies attempt to utilize someone from their ClinOps or CMC groups for being partially responsible to manage clinical supplies. However, once we get to phase 2, it becomes outside their range of expertise to manage without a dedicated person experienced in coordinating clinical supplies. And the business justification to hire or contract someone in this capacity becomes an even easier return on investment to prove for trials where the cost to obtain and retain rare patients or the cost of each dispensing unit is high, such as biologics or cell and gene therapies. As an example, if the cost to make a batch of IP is into the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, then it makes easy business sense to hire or employ someone to manage those supplies. Finally, we look at phase 3. The challenges that we saw in phase 2 are still evident, but they become amplified due to a larger number of sites, countries, patients, and longer duration of the study. There are open label extensions and extended access programs to consider for drugs making it through to marketing authorization applications. Interestingly, the shift of focus in manufacturing towards commercial supply in phase 3 means clinical supply availability reduces. I always struggled in previous lives in sponsor companies with the internal clout that CMC and commercial operations had on ring-fencing drug for their commercial scale-up and launch needs, as opposed to our needs in clinical phase 3. It seemed to me that companies should first ensure we have an uninterrupted clinical supply chain in phase 3 before we get carried away with the preparations for commercial launch. But anyway, in preparation for the marketing authorization applications, a lot of time and resource in clinical supplies management goes towards the end of study reconciliations. Sometimes that includes tens of thousands of unique kits. Being able to display to a regulatory authority that we have control of every tablet or vial made for clinical purposes is a priority, and depending on the various systems used, that can also be a challenge. Phase 3 is also usually the first time that we introduce a comparator arm, and all the global sourcing and blinding challenges that come along with it. And we'll talk more about that later. But here at the 10-minute mark is the first and only time I'll mention QPs. Regardless of phase, any study in Europe will require QP release, which necessitates, as many of us know, a detailed and time-consuming collation of batch records and quality releases, etc. So having looked at clinical supply challenges that are common within each phase of study, another way to examine these factors is by those that are common and prevalent throughout and regardless of phase. Things like cohorts, ancillaries, controlled substance designation, and on-demand or just-in-time packaging and distribution. All these increase the time, attention, and expertise needed to manage a study's clinical supply chain. The more of these that are applicable to a given study, the more risk is present, which could jeopardize a study's conduct. So let's take a deeper dive into some of the most prevalent and impactful factors. A common point of contention between clinical supply managers and their CMC and finance counterparts is overage. For our purpose, it's important to define the difference between overage and wastage. Overage is a necessary component of a supply chain. It's needed to seed sites with drug and to ensure a buffer exists to account for unpredictabilities like unpredictable enrollment and damaged IP. Factors that can affect the required overage are also here in the gray box. In contrast, we can define wastage as truly unnecessary and unutilized drug product. Think about, for example, all the kits packaged and labeled at the central depot, either expired or remaining available after the last subject last visit. This is the part of clinical supplies management where science sometimes blurs the line with art. In a clinical supply manager's job, it's to ensure an adequate amount of overage exists while also minimizing the wastage. One of the biggest factors to be considered and assessed at the outset of a study is the product's shelf life. A short shelf life, or one that will be updated and extended several times throughout the study, can dictate the entire supply strategy. For example, rather than 3 annual campaigns with a 24-country booklet label, it may be more cost-effective and prudent to perform smaller, more frequent packaging campaigns by packaging quarterly with region-based or country-specific labels. Rather than packaging syringes, like, let's say, in a 4x carton, it might be simpler to control and update retest dates of individually packaged syringes. We know that sourcing and blinding comparators for a global study can be extremely challenging. Catalent have an entire business unit of experts dedicated to guiding sponsor companies through the options for comparator sourcing strategies. In many cases, a combination approach is the best, wherein for some participating countries, the clinical sites themselves obtain the comparator, versus other cases where the comparator can be purchased and supplied in each market, versus a central sourcing approach where product from one country is sourced, labeled, and packaged and distributed to many other countries. Once this strategy is determined, curveballs can still come in the form of unexpected supply interruption or temperature excursions. And since the comparator is another innovator's product, stability data to support temperature excursions in transit or at sites isn't available. This results in all temperature excursions of the comparator, rendering it unsuitable for use and requiring replacement. The challenges surrounding comparator supply chain makes for an obvious transition to our next factor to discuss, which are regional differences. It would be a mistake for a clinical supply manager to design the patient kit and labels having only understood how hospitals, sites, and pharmacies operate in their own home country. Surely they work differently in places like Ukraine or Japan. And accounting for these differences is important to ensure the investigational products are received, stored, dispensed, and accounted for the way that we're intending. Having the supply design and plan reviewed by local CRAs or CROs can help to eliminate unforeseen errors or downstream miscommunication. The last set of factors we'll look at is a question of who. Who in the study team is defining requirements for setting up supply modules and algorithms in the IRT? Who is unblinded to manage inventories at depots and sites and in the IRT? Will you need someone to provide oversight on temperature monitoring and excursions? Who will be monitoring inventory levels and sourcing timelines of ancillary and commercial comparator supplies? Who will support final drug reconciliation and closeout for the IMP and the unblinded portion for the trial master file? If left unaccounted for, these activities can take a sponsor company by surprise, much to the detriment of the study itself, as well as to the competing priorities of their other responsibilities. Recently, I was working with a startup sponsor company whose lead compound is just entering phase 2. They had their chief development officer, the highest person in their R&D organization, reviewing label text and kit designs with us. Now, granted, their small size as a company lends itself to employees wearing many more hats than that of a large pharma. But still, a detail as minor as font size on the label is likely best left to a dedicated clinical supplies manager who has the time, experience, and expertise to know what will be readable and what will be accepted by global regulatory authorities. To best answer this question of who is doing what related to the clinical supply chain of a study, it's important to establish clear roles and responsibilities. At Catalent, our project managers use a combination of tools such as RACI charts, communication plans, and escalation plans. It's not uncommon for these tools to include teams of people working together from 4 or more organizations, like, for example, us, the CMO, the CRO, the IRT, and the sponsor company themselves. Now that we looked at the characteristics of study designs and product supply that increase the complexity of managing clinical supply chains, I want to share the tools and services that Catalent have developed to proactively manage them and the risks they pose. First, let's emphasize the proactive portion of that last statement. In some cases in the past, sponsors engage Catalent to rescue their clinical supply chain after it's too late. So any impact that a clinical supply manager could have made to reduce the risk or minimize the wastage and create an efficient supply chain is far diminished if we aren't brought in well before study start. My favorite example of this is when a sponsor started a phase 3 study. They turned on their newly built IRT to set live, and it immediately triggered shipments to all active sites in unnecessarily high quantities, which completely depleted the inventory at depots and made resupply shipments and new site activations impossible. My point being, the earlier a clinical supply manager becomes involved in a study, ideally 6 months or more before the first subject in date, the more impactful their mitigation plans can be when addressing the known risk factors we discussed earlier. In this case, having a clinical supplies manager reviewing and proposing the site initial and resupply shipment triggers in the IRT would have prevented all the drug being depleted from the depots. At Catalent, our team goes a step further and utilizes a specialized simulation tool to prevent such occurrences as well. So I've alluded to this now throughout the presentation today, but Catalent have a functional business unit called Clinical Supply Management within the Clinical Supply Services umbrella. And this is the team that I have the privilege of leading in the US. Our CSM team are experts in their field, most with more than 10 years experience managing clinical supply chains for various sponsor companies before joining Catalent. This team starts with protocol development support, contributing to the drug supply section of study protocols, and supports clients and studies straight through study closeout and preparation for inspection and regulatory submissions. We forecast the amount of drug needed for a study, devise a strategy for optimal packaging campaign size and frequency, and be the drug supply expert setting up the IRT, which means reviewing the user requirement specifications, conducting the user acceptance testing, and maintaining and updating parameters within the system, such as the look-ahead windows and the min-max settings and the prediction algorithms. Where the CSM is devising the clinical supply strategy, the Catalent project manager is then coordinating the execution of those plans by arranging with Catalent site personnel the packaging and distribution. They do this together, CSM and PM, in a continuous rhythm as the study moves along. So on a regular basis, the CSM, usually like monthly, the CSM will reevaluate the supply plan based on country and site activation and patient enrollment and supply availability, update the plans, and then the PM will adjust the plans within the CMO sites to supply the study accordingly. So far in this webinar, we've outlined the characteristics of studies and supply chains that increase the risk and or impact of not having a dedicated supply manager overseeing it. We've also acknowledged that many sponsor companies have their own internal resources or outsource to companies like Catalent, team members dedicated specifically to clinical supplies management. What we have left to figure out then is how much clinical supply support does a study need? A full FTE managing one clinical study is probably way too much and unnecessary. But that same one FTE probably shouldn't be managing 20 studies either. In order then to answer this question of how much resource is needed, we look back on how much was needed in our past trials. By analyzing previous studies and the CSM time used against them, we were able to pool our experience and identify over a dozen of the top complexity factors in terms of resource required to manage the study. Those factors fall into these 4 categories: protocol design, study scope, drug characteristics, and sponsor resources, and they can all be both objectively and quantifiably measured. Then by weighting them and scoring the factors, we can hours a month, the amount of resource a CSM should be dedicated to a given study. Thus, we have the ever-elusive resource capacity model. But that is essentially what this START score is. It's the basis of our CT success platform. START score is an evaluation tool to calculate the complexity of a potential clinical project to help identify the appropriate level of clinical supply management oversight needed to help sponsors get their project started on time and then maintain momentum as the study progresses. Once these risks have been identified, then a project team can be put together, as you see here on the bottom in blue, combining the necessary expertise to provide the integrated services and the tailored support to ensure continuity of supply from beginning to end. On the right here is a picture of the output of START score. So a low score and the needle gauge pointing towards the green section denotes that minimal CSM support is needed to ensure an efficient and risk-averse supply chain is in place. Whereas a high score and the needle over on the red section indicates that there are many risk factors inherent in study design or product itself that could impact the study in a negative way and inhibit enrollment or patient resupply. What's not pictured, but it's also part of the score, is a breakdown between how many hours of CSM resource would be required during the study setup versus the monthly maintenance, like post per subject in date. As many of you know, the bulk of effort required of clinical supply managers is in those 3 to 6 months leading up to study start and the 3 months that follow first patient in. In contrast, after the last subject is randomized, then clinical supply resource required on the study typically reduces greatly. So you're probably thinking, wait, Catalent has a calculator that's going to estimate how much I need Catalent. And that's definitely going to be skewed, right, toward the high side since it stands to benefit us. So we acknowledge that concern, and we ensure that the resulting scores were reflective of reality. This is how we resource plan ourselves. So we did this by sampling from the thousands of studies that Catalent has supported over the years, and then retroactively created a START score, and then measured that START score and the hours that the tool is predicting would be needed versus how much was actually used and needed by a CSM. And I can attest, and as you can try us out on this too, that the studies with minimal risk factors do in fact result in low scores, such that CSM services are needed minimally or sometimes not at all. What's also not pictured here in the screenshot or snapshot of the START score is a list of the factors that either do or do not contribute to the score. So if there's characteristics about the study or the supply or the product itself that make the needle go higher, then those are listed. If there's factors that drive the score down, those factors are also listed. Finally, I wanted to end with a case study, because we can talk all day theoretically, but it won't really matter unless we have examples to prove the value in real-life situations. So in this case example, we were working with a CRO customer and a clinical sponsor that both lacked an unblinded supply management role to oversee the IRT supply strategies and monitor the clinical supply inventory levels for a complex global study. The challenge was the CRO was challenged to forecast and plan for the right amount of IMP, there was a comparator, and adjunctive therapy to send from the central depot to the LATAM and the APAC depots in Europe. They needed to plan for an adequate supply that would support recruitment, yet be consumed before the expiration. In addition, resupplies across all 280 sites needed to be timed to avoid impacting patient visits. The 10 different kit types were causing frequent IRT supply triggers, thereby causing budget overruns on distribution charges. The customer was relying upon a blinded resource and unblinded IRT project managers to oversee the supply. However, this resource was only able to respond to issues in a reactive manner, as opposed to proactive planning and management and issue prevention. So the solution. So 9 months into the study, the customer turned to Catalent CSM for our help. Catalent reviewed and optimized the IRT settings, which reduced shipment volume by 20% until the end of recruitment. Once the study was fully enrolled, the IRT settings were further refined to reduce shipment volume down by 50%. Catalent developed forecasts to allow for proactive resupply planning, taking into consideration transit and customs release lead times to alleviate enrollment and patient visit impact. Upon closer examination, it was also discovered that the IRT setting for resupply triggers for expiring product was not set up to allow adequate time to dispatch 240 resupply shipments, one for each center. So all those resupply shipments were generated for a single depot on the same day, and many of which required multiple shippers and different temperature control requirements. As a result, some sites were not receiving replacement supplies in time, leaving them forced to dispense kits in inventory and asking patients to return to the site for their resupply at another time. Catalent changed these IRT settings to lengthen the time from request to actual site need, and the Catalent CSM tracked shipments and site acknowledgments to successfully alleviate this patient impact. So in conclusion, our CSM team optimized the IRT settings and removed the burden of managing the study's complex global supply needs from both the CRO and the clinical sponsor. In addition, by using forecasting tools, Catalent eliminated 2 planned resupplies, which were not required, and identified a planned shortage of comparator kits to complete the study. This case study is a good example for the discussion today because it required us to identify the complexity factors that were causing risk and pain for the supply chain, the study team, and the associated budgets. Once we identified those characteristics, we could score the amount of CSM support required. We then can dedicate that much resource to the project and yield positive, impactful results. So that concludes the presentation part of today's webinar. Thank you so much for attending and for your attention. So now, for the next 30 minutes or until the line closes and questions are up, I'd be glad to take any questions that you may have.
All right, great. Thank you, Reed. So yeah, let's move on to the Q&A. There are still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen. We have a lot of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So our first question here asks, there were so many factors that cause risk to clinical supplies that you failed to mention or identify. Why?
Oh, yeah. Good call out. So I was saying when we evaluated all of our past studies, the 12 most prevalent or impactful, a little bit over 12, factors that drive complexity and the time and resource required to manage that complexity up. We identified probably over 100 different factors, but it wouldn't be value added to include all those 100 factors. We still use those 100 factors. When we're handed a clinical protocol or meet a clinical team for the first time, we have a checklist of over 100 items of information that we're looking to obtain or glean from the protocol or from the IRT specs, but those aren't necessarily all impactful to the START score or estimating how much resource could be required to manage the clinical supplies of that given study. Yeah, good question.
All right, thank you. So let's see, the next question asks, is START score available online for anyone to try and see how their study scores? If not, who can access it?
No, it is not available online. So this is what's proprietary about the START score tool itself, is that it utilizes, like I was saying, the hundreds and thousands of trials that Catalent has run for the factors and the weighting that we use. So the way it works is when a new sponsor company presents or gets in touch with Catalent and has a study that's potentially for us to manage as a CMO, then what we do between the business development contact and the CSM experts is take the information that the study sponsor has available at that time and start creating the START score, start entering the factors that would drive the score, in some direction. And then we share that score back with the sponsor company. When we get involved early, as many of you probably know, things will change. So a blinded 2-arm study could go to a a blinded 3-arm crossover. And so the complexity factors will increase and they will change. And so it's not like once the start score is set, that's how many we know we need. It's something that can be adjusted through, before the study starts and as it's being run.
All right, thank you. So let's see. The next question asks, does the START score tool tell me how to manage my clinical supply risks?
How to manage? No, it doesn't. It doesn't show you how. What it shows you is what are the factors that are going to be complex enough that will require resource, time, and attention from a clinical supply manager to manage either before the study starts or during the conduct. So that's the part that's probably the difference between science and art. It's the START score is an equation itself. It ends up with a number. But how to manage those, that's what a CSM or a project manager do from Catalent, is once they're identified, then come up with mitigation plans to minimize their impact.
Okay, good. So let's see. What happens if my study changes such that there are less risk and complexity factors after the START score is run? Would I still be charged for all the hours it predicted?
Oh, yeah, right. So like I was just saying, so the START score can be rerun and adjusted as things about the study change. If you go from a 24-month shelf life expectation to a 6-month shelf life, that is certainly going to take more time and resource to manage. So we don't, the way Catalent does these services is that the projection of hours is just that. It's just a projection. Clients aren't charged for the hours that are projected, just the hours actually worked. Thanks.
Okay, good. Well, that's good to know. Let's see. The next question asks, your presentation didn't mention emerging trends in our industry segment, such as changing EU regulations, Brexit, smart packaging, e-labels, or direct-to-patient. Don't you think they're important or impactful?
So those things are definitely important. They're definitely impactful. They're definitely going to take more time and resource from a dedicated clinical supply manager. I think we didn't include them here because some of them are so new, like e-labels or EU regulations that aren't changed or gone into effect yet, or direct-to-patient. We don't have the evidence of historically running studies like that to know how much CSM resource it's going to take. So I think once we start running those studies, they will fall into our pool of evidence that helps tweak the START score, so that certainly those factors that you mentioned, the one that stuck out to me was direct-to-patient, where yes, we know that because it's as new as it is in our industry, it will take clinical supply management resource. We just can't estimate in a tool yet how much that will be, accurately anyway.
Well, yeah, it's just one of the things. It takes time for people to catch up to technology. All right. So let's see, our next question, and again, I do want to let everyone know we do still have plenty of time, so if you do have questions, feel free to submit them using the Q&A section on the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen. So yes, our next question, asks, can you touch on drug characteristics, especially different storage conditions, and how your organization is capable of supporting most situations?
Yeah, so this is, if you attend clinical supply conferences, you know that more restrictive and colder temperature conditions are becoming more common. So it was in years past with mostly small molecules, it was room temperature, or at worst, it was refrigerated conditions. But now we're seeing frozen and less than frozen at -80 and -120, stored on liquid nitrogen, or and then there's the flash freezing process. So in speaking for Catalent, we have different capabilities at our different main packaging and distribution centers to account for the capital investments that's required to either just store those products in those conditions or package and store those products in those conditions.
All right, great. So let's see. Our next question asks, how much contingency do you allocate to mitigate risks?
So one of the tools that we use, which I find very helpful, is it's a third-party simulation tool from Bioclinica called Optimizer. And by running simulations in Optimizer, it accounts for some variation. So for example, enrollment is the top variation, right? No one knows exactly how enrollment's going to go. And whatever you project to be the enrollment, or whatever the clinical team projects to be the enrollment and the country and site activation before the study starts, the one thing you know is it's not going to be that way once the study's running. Something will be different about it. Some countries will over-enroll, some will under, some will start earlier than they were expected, some will start later. And so by using a simulation tool, we can account for some of those differences. So we can put in like a range of, plus minus 30% on enrollment, 30% faster, 30% slower. And then by running the simulations, it shows us what would be the impact to the amount of drug needed and when it's needed to be packaged and available in the supply chain to account for those variabilities. Hopefully that answered the question.
Sounded pretty good to me. Let's see. The next question asks, how do you optimize IRT settings?
So that Bioclinica Optimizer uses simulation to actually recommend supply settings. So the initial settings, the triggers, and the min-max levels. And then by tweaking those in a simulated environment, we can see what the impact is. Because if you have larger quantities sent to site, you may minimize your distribution costs, but it would have an overall impact to the amount of drug required. So that would be a strategy that you use if you have an abundance of supply and it's cheap. Whereas if you have a limited supply or the supply is very costly, like when you're managing supplies of a comparator, you'd want to set the IRT settings close together such that you're only sending to sites what they need when they need it. And so that would increase the distribution costs, but it would not be offset enough by the cost of the comparator or the expensive IP product itself.
Okay, so let's see. The next question asks if you have any tips for managing studies using older or less sophisticated IRT systems.
So not really is the short answer. If you're stuck with an older IRT system, ways that I've seen to get around this or to make the best use of it is by increasing the resource to micromanage what you can in the IRT. So if it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, a lot of what IRT can do for drug supply management takes the place of some of the manual intervention that would otherwise be required of a clinical supply manager. So when you have an older IRT system, then it's not accounting for those things that a supply manager would have to go in and manipulate themselves.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's see. Just want to remind everyone again. If you still, we do still have some time. So if you want to ask some more questions, feel free to submit them using the Q&A tab to the left side of the screen. Let's see. This next one is a little long, but give me 1 second here. So it asks, upon arrival at the depot or site, if there is a product temperature excursion, how involved does the packaging company become in the decision process on the excursion? And then what data do you need to supply to the sponsor company so they can make a go or no-go decision on the product?
Yeah, no, that question makes perfect sense. So it's really up to the sponsor. At Catalent, we can, if we have the stability data, to assess the excursion and provide a disposition on the product. So that's usually held by the sponsor company. If we write it into the quality agreements or the master services agreements, that authority is given to Catalent, then we can provide the disposition recommendation, and then depending on the sponsor's processes, that can either be full power to make that change in the IRT, for example, to make the product either usable or not suitable for use, or then that disposition recommendation goes from us, Catalent, back to the sponsor, like the sponsor's QA, to approve that decision. So we can, within Catalent, read and understand the temperature excursion itself, compare it to the stability data which is usually a table. It's a simplified table from usually like the CMC group or stability or analytical group of a sponsor company, saying, at this temperature for this period of time, the product is still suitable for use. If it exceeds this in a high or low, beyond this value or under this value for this amount of time, then it's unsuitable for use.
Okay, great. So let's see.
And some of the, sorry,
right.
just a little bit more on that one. Some of the, I won't say better, but I'll say newer IRT functionalities is that if a sponsor company or Catalent is allowed to load those tables, those stability excursion memo tables into the IRT, then a site or a depot can enter the temperature ranges and the timeout of the product, and the IRT then having been pre-programmed with the excursion limits, acceptable and non-acceptable, can make the disposition in real time automatically. And that requires, no manual intervention by a Catalent person other than entering the temperature, time, and range, or the sponsor company. So in my viewpoint, that's like the gold standard, because it keeps a site where it turns like a 3-day process into a 5-minute process. So a site that has drug that may need it for a patient in the next hour or half day, at worst case, will have an answer on the disposition of the product, not have to wait to get in touch with 3 lines of people, the CRA to the CRO to Catalent and to the sponsor.
All right, sounds
okay.
good. All right, this will be our final question for today. We had a lot of great questions, and we couldn't get to them all, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. So let's see. This question here asks, once the supply strategy is agreed upon, how do you track and monitor the forecast against IRT actuals to allow the sponsor to be proactive and address potential areas of risk while the trial is ongoing?
Yeah, so this is the crux of a CSM, a clinical supply manager role at Catalent. It's probably similar to that within sponsor companies. So we're taking on usually a monthly basis. It depends how quick the study is going to happen, but usually on a monthly basis, what we're doing in our CSM group is we are downloading or pulling reports from the IRT, the actual enrollment, the actual site activations, and country starts, and then comparing that with the supplies available at the local depots and the central depots. And then we're projecting through the remainder of the study what the actual performance, how that impacts and changes what our plans previously were. So like I was saying before, if one country is over-enrolling another country differently than we expected initially, then we update those plans. We version control the plans. I think one of the powers of a function like CSM is that what I'm describing is a lot of data mining and coordination and version controlling, and we're using either in simple studies we'll use Microsoft Excel, in complex studies we'll use Bioclinica Optimizer. But the important part is that we're doing all that data coordination to then provide recommendations to the sponsor to say, I know this is what we initially planned. Here's what's happening in your study, and here's how I want to revise the plans. So the packaging campaign that we scheduled for next month, let's move it out 3 months. Or that packaging campaign that was supposed to be in 6 months from now, we need it sooner. Do you have manufactured product ready for us? It's enabling those types of decisions and having the data to support the recommendations. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you. Again, thank you all for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating, and I'd like to thank Catalent for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.